So I wanted to talk a little bit about queuing theory, which is like kind of my line of research, but I wanted to talk a little bit and just kind of show you the sort of breadth of kind of opportunities there are in this space. And so, anyway, the talk is sort of entitled Cues More Than Just a Line. So, the first thing I'd like to talk about is one, I love doing research, and I think, perhaps you'll see if you think, my research is cool. And one of the sort of fundamental things I really enjoy is doing research with very different people. So all the students I work with are sort of vastly different people, come from different places and backgrounds, et cetera. And this is only added to the work that we're continuing to do. And I learned this from a TV show called Daniel Tiger. And everyone is big enough to do something. And so I never really turn people away. And so I'm a true believer that even if you don't know anything, and if you guys want to start doing research with me too, feel free to come by. Everyone's big enough to do something. So I try not to turn anyone away who wants to do research with me. So just to give you kind of a picture, this is what I used to do before coming to Cornell. And so I studied kind of non-stationary cues. And just to give you a thought of what this might be, so non-stationary means things kind of vary over time. And so one of the interesting things is I was experiencing this non-stationary cue for the past month, because I normally take Pleasant Grove Road after I drop my kids off at the daycare. And I couldn't take Pleasant Grove, which is a much shorter path to getting to work. But then I had to take Thurston, and Thurston was always backed up. And if you left, if I was on time, it wouldn't be back. It'd only be backed up for 2 lights. Okay, so I only have to wait for 2 lights to get across the bridge. But if my wife wasn't on time, and she'll see this video, fortunately, but if my wife wasn't on time, I'd have to wait for 4 or 5 lights. And so just by changing the time of day, a few minutes, I actually experienced some different behavior. And so before coming here, I kind of typically worked on call centers. So, you call people up on the phone. One of the questions that I try to ask there is, like, how many of these agents do you actually need to make sure that the phones are kind of staffed properly? And other areas I worked in was in healthcare. So how many doctors or nurses do you need on your shifts to make sure that the hospital is covered? And we actually did some interesting work with Cayuga Med while I was actually here in my second year of being here. And so I kind of still do this research, but not in the same flavor. And so once I got here, I moved into a space sort of known as information and cues, and I became really interested in how when you're in a line, sometimes people might present you with information, okay? And so often they may give you the waiting time, or they may show you something that is trying to influence you to kind of move in a different space. And so so I was really interested in actually the smartphone app. So a friend of mine actually had a startup that designed an app to do waiting. And right now he's in a legal battle with Apple. But so this is also true in healthcare. So often instead of you waiting in the ER, it's possible that I can actually call you back and say, hey, it's your turn in 15 minutes. Can you drive back here and come to your appointment? And so these are interesting kind of things in the sense that it changes your perspective on what waiting is. If you're waiting at home, that's much different than you actually waiting in the ER and people are coughing on you, et cetera. So the experience is actually quite different. And I don't know if you've ever been to Ithaca Beer. They also do have an app that kind of tells you, how many people are ahead of you And so you don't necessarily have to be there. You can go shop at Home Depot before you go to Ithaca Beer, et cetera, and kind of use your time accordingly. So I was very much interested in this sort of information space as well. So one of the things that got me interested is this engineering summer math institute that is run out of DPE, and I happened to work with a couple students my first and second year here, and this was a very memorable class. Many of them graduated in 2017 or 2018. All of them were OR except for one. She happened to do CS, I don't know why. But so all of them majored in operations research kind of after this experience. And I highlight this picture and this one here. This is another group from the same Engineering Summer Math Institute. And basically working with many of these students over the summer, we actually get sort of very interesting ideas from the students over these kind of summer programs. He's the only grad student, and he's now a faculty at USC. He worked with me several years back. I want to highlight Marie. So her name is Marie Kahara. She was actually one of the students that worked with me on sort of the first class that I had. And in particular, I asked her over the summer, I never push anything on anyone. So like, I don't tell you, hey, you have to do this, because I don't like that. So I asked Marie, what are you interested in? I said, well, what do your parents do? She said, oh, my parents are doctors, et cetera. So I was like, well, do you like healthcare, et cetera? She's like, yeah, you know what? I just went to a blood clinic, and they told me I couldn't give any blood. I was like, well, what's the reason? It's like, well, I just traveled to Kenya, where my family's from, and so they told me I needed to wait like 6 months. Okay, I was like, well, too bad. Well, go back 6 months from now and donate your blood. They were having some kind of blood drive on campus. She said, well, I'm interested in studying that problem. Like, what does that even look like? And so, lo and behold, this summer, she actually started to work on this particular project. So here's an example of what she was interested in. So we actually looked at what in New York City, or not necessarily New York City, but kind of in the US, we looked at your race and your blood type. And the key piece here is that like the numbers are not the same, okay? So different racial groups have different blood types. And what's important here is that when we think about giving blood to a community, if you think about Ithaca as a whole, if Ithaca is a certain racial demographic, well, those demographics are going to be the people who are donating blood. And presumably, those demographics might even be the people who are receiving the blood, but not always. So you could have nearby counties that actually may be receiving some of the blood from time to time. And so getting a sense of what this picture looks like, to me, is important to understand not only the sort of donor pool, but you also want to understand the receiving pool. Okay? So this gives you a picture of that, like the numbers aren't the same when we think about different racial groups. Okay? Now, when we think about different cities, the racial demographics also change. Okay? So you can see New York is one of the more diverse kind of cities. And if I juxtapose that with Bismarck, North Dakota, not necessarily the most diverse city. And so you can see that different cities have different kind of makeups, and certainly the numbers change over time as kind of people move around and migrate to different places. But this gives you a sense that not all cities are the same in terms of their racial demographics. So once again, when we think about donating blood or receiving blood, you have to think about who's there and what are their blood types, et cetera. So why is this information important? Okay, so it turns out that one of my good friends from grad school is not able to give blood, and so anyone care to guess why? They're not from the UK, from Atlanta, actually.
Well, you don't even, I think they still won't take blood from homosexual men, I think.
I think that changed.
Did that
Did they
change?
have a blood disease?
No blood disease per se.
Lived in England.
No HIV, no England, no sickle cell. So, and it's not only sickle cell, if you have a sickle cell trait. So 1 in 13 African Americans have a sickle cell trait. So what does this suggest? That, hey, this group of people can't even donate. So if you're in a city that has a receiving population of a particular blood type, you might not be able to get it from, a large portion of this particular group. Okay? And so understanding this is really important. And so part of her project during the summer, so there's another, what part of her project was to make this sort of blood Q simulator. Okay? So what we wanted to do was think about, okay, take a city, look at its population, think about who's donating, who's not donating. There are other considerations. So there are some people who are fearful of donating blood. One, you have to be in some registry. So if you think about your immigration status or different things like that, people are kind of fearful of donating blood. So there's a lot of considerations when we're thinking about kind of donating blood. And so her goal was to make kind of a simulator of this process. And one of the things that she was interested in was thinking about cities that could be matched up. So often what we would see in this simulator, and I wish that Apple would just have Flash, because this was made with Flash. And but nonetheless, one of the things that we would see is that one city would have a shortage, and one city would have an overage. And so the thought is that, can we actually combine nearby cities who have a shortage of some type, and some cities have an abundance of a particular type? Can we sort of combine them together? And lo and behold, like a year later, so we talked about this at a winter simulation conference in Vegas. So another beautiful thing about doing research. Talked about this in Vegas, and like a year later, there was a startup that basically did exactly what we started to do in New York City. And so what they were doing was going by nearby states and sort of taking blood from the nearby states to actually use in the city for a variety of different things. One other thing I'll mention about this kind of simulator that we built is that we were also interested in giving you blood that was fresher. Okay, so it's quite well known that if you receive blood in like a transfusion, the fresher the blood actually is, the more sort of the better your outcomes actually are in doing in that procedure. And so blood actually expires 42 days, so you got 6 weeks to use it. And this is why they're constantly having drives, because there is an expiration date. They won't use it after the 6-week mark. And so one of the things we wanted to do was, like, could we provide people with fresher blood as opposed to giving them? So the policy right now is like, the oldest blood that's there, we give it to you, okay? And this is a first in, first out kind of policy, and so generally that's bad in terms of the outcome. So one of the things that we used this simulator to do was, well, let's just try to give people blood that's 14 days old or less first, and then we'll apply the sort of blood that's been in there longest, okay? And the question is, how much more do you waste, okay? So first in, first out is provably optimal in terms of giving out the blood and not wasting it. But we wanted to know if we applied this strategy, 14 days, we did a 21 days, we did a 7 days. And 14 days only wasted about 0.5% more. If you move it out, you slowly get to the optimal thing. But we saw 14 days actually did quite well, and it actually would improve kind of outcomes of patients. So that was one of the interesting things we did with this simulator. And actually, Stanford, I believe, is using a policy like this to do their kind of blood, because they saw that you wouldn't actually waste much of it at all. So anyway, so that's Marie, and so there's kind of queuing theory in here, but is a totally different kind of thing of you kind of waiting in line, thinking about kind of you waiting in line. But I do want to highlight this young lady here. She's a graduate of Ori in 2018, Samantha Nuremberg. What was interesting about her is that she was I taught this 1050 course for the first time, and she was like my student helper in the course. And because of her, like, I got an award, but I didn't really do anything. She like did all the work. I had a little bit of vision, but she did all the work, and she also got an award that year for the 1050. And so she's from Florida, and she really likes a place in particular, and that's Disney. And so anyway, she came to me and I said, hey, like, you really like Disney? Well, in her sophomore year, I said, well, we don't have any data on Disney, and I'd like to get someone. People always ask me all the time, like, did you design Disney? And I tell them, no, but my friend did. And so, do you work on Disney? No, but my friend does. So it's time for me to work on Disney. So I said, well, we don't have any data. So what I need for you to do is go collect it. Okay? Now, we didn't send her to Disney, but she does have a season pass. But I said, okay, well, here's their app. Okay? What I need for you to do is take all the information that they have on the app, and what we're going to do is every second take a snapshot of the app and record all of the data. So we connected to the API in the app and basically collected all the data. We did this for a year. So, like, no work, like, for a year. Her job was to keep this thing going for a year. It turns out we had, like, some kind of storm, and this was, like, connected to my, like, desktop in my office. So we had a storm, and lo and behold, the power went out during that storm. And so we missed 3 days of that storm. It happened over the weekend. So we missed 3 days, and then I said, okay, don't do that again. Next time we're going to have it, connected properly, so we won't lose any information. But we collected a year of information from this particular app. And I'm glad we did, because maybe a couple years later, they stopped you having the ability to connect to the API and actually getting the information. And so they kind of shut it down. But nonetheless, here's a picture of what the app looks like. And as you can imagine, the app tells you the wait times of the rides that are somewhat nearby you. Okay? And so what do you have now? You have a choice. Okay? You have a choice of which ride you're going to select and which ride you're going to go to. Okay? And so in particular, I'm going to take the 2 rides that are here, okay, and kind of show you what the dynamics of that ride is like. And so in particular, you see what happens. Well, one ride is higher. A few minutes later, it switches. The other ride is higher. It switches again. The other ride is higher. And it basically goes back and forth. Okay? I select those 2 because they're pretty close to one another. And there's no, like, sort of dominating factor, like this ride everyone wants to get on as opposed to some of the others in the park. And so we see this sort of back and forth behavior of the app and what people are kind of getting. And so it's natural that you see the ride here is high. Well, let me go to the other one. And what's interesting is that everyone else is also seeing the same information. So collectively, you're all making the same decision, most likely, and you're moving to this ride, and then it shifts it up. Okay? Yes, that is possible. So that is something that you wouldn't be able to observe from the app, but you could observe from, like, if they actually kept track of what ride you were doing, which they weren't doing at the time. So that is a possibility. And another possibility is that you could actually put them far apart as well. You could look kind of at rides far apart. There isn't that much of a connection in terms of people walking all the way over here to do that. But if you actually sync up their sort of wait time, so this one's large, this one's small, and these are the only kind of things in the park, then you could actually see some of that behavior too. So a big question is, we wanted to study what this behavior was. It turns out this is an oscillation. There's a mathematical term for this called the Hop bifurcation. And we wanted to see if we can build kind of a queuing model to sort of mimic this behavior that we see here. One thing I want to mention about the app, though, is that one of the things that's important is that the app is not updated like in real time. So what happens is you see, 5-minute wait, and you see that for like 5 minutes, and then Disney says, oh, it's time to update the app now. And then, boom, they update it, and then all the rides get refreshed, and then you wait another 5 minutes, rides get refreshed, etc. So one of the things here is that it's not necessarily in real time, and we also want to be able to model that aspect of this as well. So I'm going to have to, unfortunately, get into some math, but don't necessarily, you don't have to understand everything, but I want to give you a picture of kind of what's going on. The model that we decided to build, you can think of this as, the number of people who are waiting. So Q sub I is the number of the people who are waiting at ride I at time t. Okay. Well, this is some like initial number of people there. Generally, this is like 0. Okay. Park opens, nobody's there. Okay. Now, this is the number of people. So this is our arrival rate lambda. This is the number of people who join that ride. And in particular, there's a PI. So there's a probability that you choose that I, and it's based on the current kind of queue length. Now, what's important here is that we're not going to look at the current queue length. We're actually going to look 5 minutes behind, okay? Or we're going to look at the last update, because that's how you're making your decision. So I got into studying kind of how people kind of use this information. And how do I choose this queue? Well, we're going to use something called the multinomial logit model, which is what we call a choice model. If you talk to Ricardo Daziano, he's an expert in choice models. Well, tries to model how people make choices based on some kind of behavior. In this particular case, I care about how long the queue length is or what my waiting time is. Okay? So the longer I have to wait, the less likely I am to choose that particular line. So that's kind of how we built our choice model. What's interesting here is we now have this, this function here. This is the floor function. And what I'm trying to model here is that the system is updating every delta units. So delta is our modeling parameter. You can think of this as 1 minute, 5 minutes, etc. So what happens is that what I'm seeing from the perspective of the app doesn't change until I get another update from the app. In reality, this is not a constant, but the thing you can model are constants. So we use that as kind of a baseline. Here's a picture of kind of, so what happens is the app information stays constant during that time, and then there's an update. It stays constant for some time. It updates. So this kind of gives you a picture of kind of what this function actually looks like. I want to emphasize that, well, what happens in a real park is that there's many people. And so one of the things that I do is I prove something called limit theorems, okay? And what's a limit theorem? I'll try to show you that what happens is I try to scale up my queuing system, and you can think of this as, having more and more customers in the park. And what we do is kind of scale down their importance. So if I have a lot more people, your individual contribution becomes a little smaller. Okay? And what we try to do is I'll take this limit as, in this case, this parameter eta goes to infinity, and I want to show that this kind of stochastic thing, this is a random object, is a random number of people joining the rides. This thing actually converges to something that is deterministic, okay, if you take the limit. And I want to give you a picture of what this looks like. So this is kind of what happens. This is the regular system. What I do is I scale things up, but I shrink you a little bit. Your importance becomes smaller. And what you can see is if you actually scale the system up large enough, it looks like this. And you can try this at home. Turn on your faucet just a little bit. It'll start dripping. That's that. And as you turn on the faucet, well, you're increasing the rate, and it'll start looking like a fluid. Okay? And what does fluid mean? That means differential equations. Mechanical engineers love this. Okay? So this means I could take my kind of stochastic system, which I don't necessarily know how to solve, and I could sort of mimic it with a differential equation, which then you ask your mechanical engineering buddies, hey, how do I solve this? And that's what I did. I asked Richard Rand, how in the heck do I solve this? We wrote some papers together. So that's kind of an interpretation of the fluid limit, and then we got some differential equation that describes the dynamics, and then we were able to give some pretty pictures where you actually get to see, okay, the system kind of moves up and down, and you actually do get this sort of oscillatory behavior. You can change kind of the shape of these kind of oscillations by kind of changing the model parameters. What's also true is that this parameter delta also governs whether we get kind of oscillations forever or the oscillations actually kind of fade out. And so I'll show, I think, another example. Here's where the oscillations are a bit bigger, but there are examples where the oscillations actually will fade out over time. So actually you want that in many cases. And so we were able to somewhat think about, can we mimic this behavior using kind of these queuing models? So here's an example of where the oscillations actually go towards zero. And you actually want this because what is this telling me? Well, half the people are going to one place and half are going to the other place, and that's kind of the best thing for the system. All right. I'm going to tell you another project I worked on, and I'm happy to take questions. Two things. One, can they do it in real time? So that's one question. Short answer is no. But if they could do it in real time, does the behavior change? And then the second question becomes, can I now lie to the customers? Okay, so I want to achieve a particular wait time at a, let's say, a particular ride. How do I lie to the customers to kind of achieve that? To get yeah. So that's where you can actually use this to do that. And so that is achievable. So lying is not necessarily bad, always. Don't tell my kids that, though. Any other questions? No? So another project I worked on this time with this guy is Robert Hampshire. You've already met Andrew. And we worked on something called teleoperations centers. Robert's now the deputy transportation secretary, so he's one below Pete Buttigieg. And he's a buddy of mine that I've known for many years. And so he also went to Princeton, and I remember joining. Our advisor would introduce us, and they're like, "Oh, you're Robert. You're the new Robert." And I was like, "Not quite. He's actually awesome, and I'm not so awesome." But anyway, that's Robert. And what did we work on? So we worked on this particular project of thinking about how to think about how autonomous vehicles will actually work in practice. So this is like a notion of getting them to level 5, which means that they can do anything they want to do in any condition and, not kill you, effectively. And so we're not quite at level 5, and this was a proposed solution by this startup called Designated Driver. There's lots of different startups now, that when your sort of autonomous vehicle gets in trouble or gets in some situation it can't handle, what they will do is farm it out to someone who can actually help. So think of this as OnStar, but actually someone who can control your car, okay? And they could get you to your destination if the car hasn't imploded or something like that. So this was a startup, and we became interested in kind of thinking about, well, how can we model these kinds of new situations? And I want to emphasize, this is not just for like what we think of autonomous driving outside. This also could be used in manufacturing plants or large kind of warehouses. So if you ever go visit a Walmart warehouse or Amazon warehouse, there's tons of like trucks and things going on and things moving around. And so this kind of technology could also be used in those kind of facilities as well. Actually, Toyota is interested in kind of building these things for kind of warehouses as well. So we've been interested in like, okay, well, how many of these people do you actually need? And we wrote this paper sometime in I'll say 2019 or something like that. There's a lot of pushback, so much pushback. Oh, I don't think autonomous vehicles are real, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm pointing to the people who refereed our paper the first time. A lot of pushback, and we don't think it's real, etc. But lo and behold, now teleoperation is sort of being mandated across the U.S. And I'm going to highlight a particular place, in particular, Phoenix. So me and my student just went to Phoenix for the Informs conference. And lo and behold, we were able to see the technology working with our own eyes. And so what's interesting is that teleoperation is mandated in Arizona, which is, it's required if you're going to run an autonomous vehicle. Probably not going to happen here, especially in Ithaca. It snows too much. So you can get your autonomous vehicle for the summer, but I don't know about the winter. We still have some issues to iron out there. But what I wanted to say is that what we wanted to do with this is two things. One, when your system is actually, like if your car is in trouble, we want someone to kind of assist you. The other aspect that we were also interested in is teaching the car how to drive. Okay? So when a car is presented with a situation, well, what does it actually do? So suppose I try to give this example that there's, a kid in the road with a plastic bag over them. Well, is it a plastic bag or is it a kid in the road with a plastic bag pretending to be a ghost? So you don't know. And so what should the car do? Should the car just, go and hit the plastic bag, or should it actually stop? And so what we do is actually we give this information to a bunch of these kind of operators, and we actually see what they would do. And the car actually, hopefully they do the right thing, but we actually help the car kind of learn from the kind of human experience. And so it turns out you actually need a lot of these people to kind of help the car learn from the experience. And so we were also interested in using the teleoperations center to help kind of guide where the car should be going. There's this interesting example, actually, and I'll mention this. Why this is an interesting topic for me personally is that I worked on a car named Little Ben. I went to UPenn when I was an undergrad, and Little Ben was a car that I actually worked on. So DARPA did a series of challenges in 2005 and 2007 to actually spur the technology in terms of autonomous vehicles. And actually, at the time, Stanford was kind of the leader in this space, and their faculty advisor was Sebastian Thrun, and he actually started Waymo. Google said, "Hey, we'll give you $20 million for 2 years, and come hang out with us." And he actually started Waymo, which is now in. Let's see if this actually works. So this is me at that conference watching the Waymo drive itself. So you can actually take the Waymo from the airport and drive all around town in Phoenix. Here's a big question. Does it cost more or less?
I would guess more at this point.
Think it costs more to drive in the Waymo? No driver.
Big investment in technology.
Big investment in technology. Right now, it's about the same price. Trick question. But
Liability?
there are liability issues. But what are you really paying for? Well, the car is actually a Jaguar. And don't mind this being tilted. It's actually going to flip around in a second. So this is us driving in this Waymo.
Don't touch the steering wheel or pedals.
And
You may use and show your cameras. Check on riders.
Yeah, I really want to see it turn.
Our microphones are only on when you're connected to rider support. So sing your heart out.
anyway, so you can actually ride in these cars now, and they're actually using a teleoperations company. There's Autopia, designated driver, as a kind of resource if the cars kind of get stuck. And I think when we went to the conference, everyone was kind of amazed. And so that they were working pretty efficiently. The only accidents that they've gotten in are the ones that are caused by the humans. They generally get hit from behind. What's interesting also is that I also took a non-Waymo taxi as well. And I asked if have you ridden in the Waymo, and they're like totally, like the whole taxi community is totally against the technology, which is interesting story. This leads me to a new topic, which is sort of near and dear to my heart. And these are two. One, this is an undergraduate, Shrisha, and Laurel, who's a grad student in Ori. Shrisha, once again, is defected to CS. But I'm trying to pull her into Ori, and one of the best students I've had in a class. So anyway, so she approached me about kind of doing research, and as you know, there's this engineering learning initiatives. They didn't give us the money, but I told her do the research with me anyway, and it has worked out. She's really smart student, so much so that she's taught me over the summer. So in particular, I wanted to learn more about animation. She didn't know anything about animation, but her goal was to teach me over the summer. So, and she did a really good job. And so here's what I've been interested in, and this is sort of a little bit sort of happened before COVID, but it takes time to kind of get these things done. We were interested in kind of modeling when people are in a queuing system, how might they get infected? Okay. So in particular, we look at a very simple kind of model. We call it an MM1. It's a single server. So think of people lining up to one bank teller. And you have people sort of coming in at some rate, and it takes some rate to process them, all right? And turns out every once in a while, someone's going to come in, they're going to start coughing, and you're going to be a little more cautious. What's interesting is, like 4 years ago, I would have never thought anything of anyone coughing in any line. And now I'm so like, I'm getting less caring about it, but I'm much more aware of it now than I've ever been in my life. And so anyway, so we were interested in modeling, okay, if you have someone come in, they're infectious, they actually spend some time with you in the line, do they actually infect you? Okay? And so that's what we wanted to kind of model and try to understand. Ironically, yesterday there's a call exactly for this research from some NSF and NIH combination. So they said we want to be prepared for the next pandemic, and they want to understand social kind of behaviors of getting infected. So anyway, I have some work to do for February. But so here's a question. So what we're going to do is say, okay, this person is infected. You're clearly close to these customers. One of the things we're going to do is say, okay, well, if you're in line with this customer long enough, you also will get infected. But we'll make the assumption that you'll get infected, but you won't infect anyone else in the line. Okay? Mainly, okay, Henry coughs on me. I will get infected, but I won't be infected today, so I wouldn't infect Leslie or anyone else, right? So sorry, Henry. But so this is our model, and so what we're going to do is we're going to have some threshold L. So you can think of, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever the CDC wants to tell you, 20 minutes. If you're in line with that person for that amount of time, you also will get infected. Okay? And so we were interested in modeling, okay, what's the probability that you as a susceptible customer, someone who's not infected, gets infected in the line. Why is this relevant? Well, every model that, I kid you not, every model that is out there never has looked at an individual perspective. So the most popular models is this SIR model or SEIR variants of that. So it's a susceptible, infected, and recovered kind of model. And they only look at large populations, okay? They never actually focus on the individual. Okay? And what we really wanted to understand was, how are you impacted given your behavior, et cetera? And anyway, I think obviously this work is amazing, et cetera. So this is the model we kind of set up. And to give you some math for the day, we actually came up with the probability that you get infected in this particular line under these kind of model scenarios. So the beautiful thing here is actually we have a formula, and the formula can be kind of digested in a couple components, okay? This first piece here is, well, I need you to stay in the line at least L. Like if you don't stay in the line at least L, then obviously you're not going to get infected, okay? The other pieces come from two components. One component is I can get infected from someone who's already in the line before me, or I can get infected from someone who comes behind me and is also sick. And so I need to keep track of these kind of two components. And, you put stuff together, we come up with this formula. And I want to emphasize this is the first time that someone has actually calculated an individual kind of probability of being infected, in this system, but we can kind of generalize the different kind of systems and scenarios. But
So, Jamal,
yes.
do those other models just say, like, anyone in that line has a 20% chance, or say, like, 30% of the people in that line will get infected?
No. So generally what the SIR models do is they will give you a curve. So it will sort of look like, okay, well, let's say one person is infected. And then what you will see is that the curve will start shooting up of the infected people. And as they come to recover, it'll come back down. So it just gives you a number. So this is, we're interested in this as well, but you want those particular models just tell you, here's the number of people that are going to get infected over some period of time. So it tries to model that behavior. So once again, it doesn't give you your own individual sort of probability of being kind of infected. The other thing that it sort of fails to model is that if I'm in a line like this, I'm not necessarily interacting with everyone else, okay? So the people who come behind me before or after I leave, I don't care about them. They don't actually matter to me. There are some scenarios where that doesn't necessarily work, and I'll give you an example of this, is that Sorry, Leslie. But suppose Leslie comes into the room. She has a cold. She's sick. She coughs in the room. Okay? She actually leaves the room. It's not like her cough has disappeared. Yeah, you didn't take your cough with you. So actually her presence is actually still here, or those particles are still here. It takes some time to actually diffuse in the air, etc. And so actually we're interested in doing that too. So some of the work we've done here actually extends to that case where she kind of coughs in the room, but she's kind of still around. So I want to emphasize that this is like the first time people have looked at like individual kind of situation. We will see if this moves. All right. So not only do you care about yourself, hopefully, you also care about the community. And so the SIR models model kind of the community kind of behavior. And so we were interested, well, how is the community impacted as well? So what do? Well, if you're infected, how many people do you infect? Okay. So we should care about that. So one person can infect many people. And so we would like to know how many people do you infect if you are actually infected. Okay? And so we came up with a number. So this is the expected value of the number of people that you infect. Once again, it's pretty easy to interpret if you do queuing. You need to stick around. So this is the probability you stick around or that infectious person sticks around for L. And there's a 2 here because you can be infected. You can infect people before you who are in the queue before you arrive. And you can also infect people from behind. And this number here is roughly the mean number of people that are in the line. So it's a nice kind of decomposition of really understanding kind of the behavior. We also have a formula that, so I want to emphasize that there's 2 different kind of curves. So one curve is in blue. These are all the different transmissions. So these are when someone comes in and they infect someone, I count that as 1. Okay. It turns out that when the queue is kind of very lightly loaded, there's not that many people in the queue, the number of transmissions is equal to roughly equal to the number of new infections. However, when the queue is actually fairly large, these things diverge from one another. And the story is that, okay, well, Henry's in the queue. He gets infected by someone. It's highly likely, so I count that one. But perhaps there's a second person who's also infected. They also would infect Henry. So that would count in a transmission, but it wouldn't count as a new infection. Okay? And so what happens is that in a larger system, you're more likely to get infected by multiple people. They do count as transmissions, but they don't count as a new infection. It only counts as 1. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's important to understand the individual behavior as opposed to just the collective behavior, especially when we're in systems that are fairly large. There's a disconnect between what actually happens to you and what we're seeing in the community. Yeah, so what you would assume is that there's, when you say one illness, do you mean
So COVID, instead of the
COVID and,
plus
so you should talk to Laurel because Laurel's working on the extension of this to, any number of illnesses. Infinitely much more challenging question from a mathematical point of view. And is very much non-trivial. So I'm hoping we can get some results on that question, but it is actually a much more challenging question. What I was also thinking you were saying was that we also assume, like in this particular model, when we think about you infecting other people, we assume everyone else is susceptible. They're not infected. And so this is the reason why you have this kind of disconnect, because not everyone is infected and they could be infecting the same people that you're also. It turns out the way that we modeled it was actually the best thing possible, because this parameter L, you now can actually randomize it, okay? So if I randomize it, well, for some people, L is smaller. For some people, L is larger. Some people, it varies. So a question is like, does it stick for you, or does it stick for, other people? And so we could actually randomize that according to some distribution and kind of change that. So in particular, you could say, okay, how infectious am I, right, and cough. And the question is, how much do you ingest, right? Research suggests the more you ingest, the more infected you kind of become, et cetera. So, which is why, I always suffer the brunt, because I spend so much time with my kids that, I'm ingesting a lot of particles from them, and 3 of them. So,
Building your immunity.
It's amazing to see how my immunity has gotten better from year 1 of daycare to year 5. So, but anyway, so this is that picture. We also have a formula for the variance. So not everything, evolves around the mean. It's a more complicated formula for the variance. And why is this? Well, now we can build kind of an interval of where we think how many infected people might be infected because of this one customer. So we can kind of, it's not quite a confidence interval, it'll be called a prediction interval around that expected number. So this is, and to be honest, most of the SIR models are all deterministic. So there's no notion of kind of stochastic kind of behavior or random kind of behavior. So you wouldn't even see a variance pop up in those situations. I want to mention something here. So we actually did an analysis of looking at the probability and comparing it to simulation. Okay, and so for most of the things are good. But I want to emphasize the reason why the formulas are actually quite useful is that often simulation doesn't necessarily work as you want it to work. And I mean that in the context of if you only have 10 minutes, you might not be simulating the right thing, okay? And so you can see some of the numbers here actually are a bit off from one another, and that's because we actually haven't simulated long enough. And this is the value of actually having a formula, so I don't have to do kind of simulation. I can just use my formula instead. And so beauty of mathematics allows us to avoid doing the simulation altogether and wasting energy on those servers. So I have 2 minutes, and I'm going to run through this, and I probably should have given this, but here are the 2 students that have worked on this. A thing that I became interested is applying kind of probability for bail reform, and I was inspired a little bit by the story of Khalif Browder, who actually grew up not too far away from where I did. I won't go into the story, you can go and Google it, but one of the things that we're interested in is modeling kind of a community bail fund. This is the one here in Tompkins County. There's an office called Opportunities, Alternatives, and Resources downtown. And the idea is that people like you would donate to the bail fund. The bail fund money can be used for defendants who are, not for felonies, but for kind of small issues. And they can actually not spend time in jail, and they can actually spend time with their families, et cetera, until their court date. Ideally, they show up to all their trials, and the money is pumped back into the bail fund, and it sort of continues on. That's the idea. So actually, one of the interesting things that came out of it was, okay, well, they got a donation. This particular bail fund got a donation. Question is, how long will this donation last? And in particular, that's important because if they fail to show up, the money is lost for that particular person. And there's also poundage. If the person turns out to be guilty, the portion of the money goes to the courts to cover their costs. Okay, and so we were interested in modeling kind of this behavior. I won't go into the equations, but lo and behold, you can actually model what's going on in this bail fund, and we have built a simulator, and we have actual equations that kind of model what's going on in the bail fund. I want to show you one picture. This particular picture is we had a model where you would be blocked if the bail fund does not have enough money. And so what we wanted to do was figure out how much money do we need to sort of stabilize the performance of the bail fund. So the probability that you are blocked is pretty low here. And so we wanted to figure out, well, what kind of investment do we need to sort of keep the bail fund kind of stable over time? So you need kind of a proportion of cash kind of coming in, every so often to stabilize the performance of the bail fund. And that's something that we can actually do. So so that was one of the things that I really enjoy about this particular project. And we're doing a lot of more complicated things, working with different counties to see if we can actually put the bail funds kind of together, and like what's the impact of kind of putting bail funds together as opposed to kind of keeping them separate. One last thing, what's next in the queue? And the next thing I'm working on is figuring out how much time your kid is out sick, okay? And so this is a big challenge for myself, and I know lots of young families, and I've been interested in, okay, if you have multiple children, how does this impact your day, et cetera? And so we actually have a paper that's going to be presented at this winter simulation conference in San Antonio in December, and I'll actually talk on computing the probability your kid is out of daycare, and I can give an estimate of how many days you'll spend dealing with that based on the number of kids you have. And it actually can get fairly high. So I have 3 kids, and it was pretty accurate saying I've spent like a quarter of my time outside of dealing with illnesses, especially during like this stretch. So from November to March. So yeah. Luckily now you can just send your kids sick to elementary school. They won't send them home. So, but the daycare is more strict about your kid being sick. But it's interesting. My own mother, I remember I was on the subway and I was like, I'm not feeling well. She's like, you better get to school. And sure enough, I showed up, and that's the way it is. So with that, thank you. And and I truly mean it. If you do want to do research with me, stop by. We can start some.